Welcome to today's Explainer. We're putting on our historical detective hats today because we are investigating the historical, linguistic, and physical clues behind the origins of the Qur'an. Our entire journey today is based on a really fascinating historical critical and biblical theological assessment written by Marc Bates. We're going to look closely at what modern philology, paleography, and textual criticism actually have to say about this ancient sacred text. Let's get right into it.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The standard Islamic narrative. 2. Linguistic and phonetic paradoxes. 3. Geographical and manuscript anomalies. 4. Intertextual source borrowings. 5. The Islamic dilemma. And finally 6. Inlibration versus Incarnation.
All right, starting us off with Section 1, the standard Islamic narrative. So to understand the historical critique, we first need to understand the baseline official story. The traditional account, often called the standard Islamic narrative, asserts that the Quran was dictated verbatim by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. Crucially, it claims this happened natively in the 7th century Meccan dialect of the Quraysh tribe, and that the text was later codified and preserved with absolute letter-perfect uniformity. Basically, it's viewed as an uncreated, eternal book delivered perfectly into a local environment. But as Bates outlines, modern comparative linguistics and textual criticism brings some pretty fascinating structural tensions in this narrative to light.
Which brings us to Section 2, Linguistic and Phonetic Paradoxes.
Let's talk about what scholars call the Hamza paradox. According to classical Arabic grammarians, native Meccans in the western Hijaz spoke a dialect that actually softened or completely dropped the glottal stop, known as the Hamza. So a word like Rus, for head, would just be pronounced Rus. Make sense? Now, if the text was dictated in this native Meccan dialect, you'd expect that glottal stop to be entirely absent. Yet, the original consonantal skeleton of the Qur'an contains specific structural seats built directly into the text to explicitly hold this glottal stop. This points straight away from an isolated Meccan street vernacular, strongly indicating that the scribes who formulated the text were trained in northern or eastern scribal traditions where that heavy glottal stop was very much pronounced.
Now, what's really wild here is the sheer volume of foreign vocabulary. The text itself claims to be in a pure, perspicuous Arabic tongue. However, looking at Arthur Jeffery's famous 1938 catalog, we see over 300 non-Arabic loanwords embedded directly in the text. We're talking about highly complex theological, legal, and liturgical terms borrowed from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Hebrew. For instance, the word for gospel, Angel, comes from Greek. Firdaus, for paradise, comes from Persian. Bates notes that this cosmopolitan accumulation heavily suggests the raw material of the text was actually formulated in a plurilingual northern borderland, somewhere like the Syro-Palestinian corridor or the Iraqi borders, rather than an isolated 7th century Meccan trading hub.
And this geographical footprint gets even more specific when we look at the Christonymic anomaly, which is just a fancy way of saying the specific name used for Jesus. In late antiquity, the Western Jacobite church, prevalent near Mecca and the Hijaz, called Jesus Yeshu, which naturally translates into Arabic as Yesu. But the Quran doesn't use Yesu, instead it uses Isa. Linguistically, Isa is an Arabic phonetic derivation of Isho, a term used by the Eastern Nestorian Church, located hundreds of miles away to the northeast in the Lakhmid-Sasanian borderlands of southern Iraq. So that specific Christological vocabulary acts as a literal linguistic footprint pointing far to the north and east.
Let's move from linguistic DNA to physical artifacts. Section 3, Geographical and Manuscript Anomalies. When you read the internal environment described in the text, it consistently clashes with the actual physical topography of Mecca. The text describes a sanctuary city surrounded by lush vegetation, grain fields, and abundant olive trees. But, surprisingly enough, olive trees are botanically incapable of growing in the hyper-arid desert soil of Mecca. They're native to the Mediterranean basin and stop growing around northern Jordan. The text also mentions the audience passing by the ruins of Lot's people, up near the Dead Sea, in the morning and at night. That is an absolutely impossible daily commute from Mecca, which is over 600 miles to the south. Plus, the altercations described are with tribes like Midian and Thamud, whose historical territories are way up in northwestern Arabia and southern Jordan. Let's see how this all builds when we look at paleography, the physical evolution of the Arabic script itself. The earliest scripts lack diacritical dots and vowels entirely, meaning a single word could easily have dozens of grammatically plausible readings. This directly led to the multiple official Arabic readings we see later on.
We also have amazing physical evidence like the mid-7th century Sunna palimpsest, where an erased lower text reveals major textual variants and non-standard alignments. Furthermore, those beautiful formal Kufic manuscripts that are often claimed to be original 7th century copies, they actually date to the 8th and 9th centuries, developing in the Iraqi city of Kufa. The standardized version that's widely used today was actually finalized by a committee in Cairo in 1924. Bates highlights this timeline to demonstrate that the text underwent physical editing and standardization over centuries, severely challenging the idea of an immediate perfect transmission.
Moving right along to Section 4, Intertextual Source Borrowings.
Now, Bates points out that the text doesn't just adapt material from the canonical Bible. It heavily borrows from unbiblical legends, Jewish midrash, and Christian apocrypha that were widely circulating at the time. For example, the story of a raven showing Cain how to bury Abel. That isn't in Genesis, it comes directly from a 2nd century Jewish midrash. How about the famous quote that saving one life is like saving all mankind? That's actually a rabbinic commentary from the Mishnah. And the story of a young Jesus making clay birds fly is taken right out of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is a 2nd century apocryphal fable. These borrowings deeply embed the text in the shared, plurilingual religious marketplaces of late antique Judaism and Christianity.
Let's shift gears to theology. Section 5, the Islamic Dilemma.
So, the crucial point here is how this historical data intersects with the text's very own claims about previous revelations. The Qur'an repeatedly affirms the divine inspiration and preservation of the Jewish and Christian scriptures present at that time. Yet, it simultaneously denies their absolute core tenets, like the historical crucifixion or Trinitarian language. Bates neutrally points out that this creates a logical construct known as the Islamic dilemma. Horn A, if the prior scriptures are authentic exactly as the text affirms, then the text's denials of their core claims must logically be false. Horn B, if the prior scriptures were already physically corrupted, then the text is repeatedly affirming, commanding adherence to, and telling its own prophet to consult corrupted, false writings. It's a major self-referential tension.
Finally, Section 6, Inlibration versus Incarnation.
The real vulnerability Bates identifies here stems from a theological concept called Inlibration. This is the belief that the divine word enters the world exclusively as an uncreated, mechanically dictated book. Because the dogma insists every single letter is the eternal speech of God, any historical evidence of manuscript evolution, paleographical standardization, or linguistic borderland influence directly threatens the revelation itself. Bates contrasts this with the biblical model of incarnation, where the definitive revelation isn't a book dropped from the sky, but a person, the eternal Logos made flesh. Because it is anchored in messy historical reality and human witness, the presence of historically contingent languages, copyist variants, and human authors doesn't shatter the core redemptive doctrines. In fact, under this model, historical contingency is entirely expected.
And this brilliantly illustrates Bates's application of Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan framework. Bates uses this framework to show that biblical theology traces a single progressive unfolding of God's redemptive oath, starting in Genesis and going all the way to the incarnate Messiah. It isn't just a series of disconnected dispensations where previous messages are entirely wiped out and deemed corrupted. No, it is a historically grounded, covenantally unified plan that even maintains an irrevocable calling for ethnic Israel. By recognizing that God works through history rather than bypassing it, this framework naturally absorbs the realities of historical text transmission without breaking down.
We've covered some truly incredible ground today. From glottal stops and Nabatean orthography to Mediterranean olive trees, centuries of script evolution, and the deep theological contrasts between an uncreated book and the incarnate word. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How does recognizing the deep historical, linguistic, and intertextual footprints of an ancient sacred text reshape our understanding of how divine revelation actually enters the human story? It's a profound question, and one that really invites us to look closely at the messy, absolutely fascinating reality of human history. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.